Hello and welcome to NewsClick. This week marks 50 years of the internet. And to talk about the origins of the internet, how and why it was created, and the power it holds in our lives today, we have with us Prabir Purkayastha. So Prabir, to start with, can you tell us more about the origins of internet and why it was envisioned?
Well, the origins of the internet, as it always happens, has an official history and a real history. And how much the official and the real history intersect is an open question. So, of course, the official history is it came with this ARPANET, which was set up by DARPA, which came from the defense requirement of having a robust network which could survive attacks on the United States, and therefore its decentralized structure, etc., etc. And what we celebrate as the 50 years of the internet is the fact that two computers in two different universities could talk to each other as a part of the DARPA project or the ARPANET project, which really, as you know, transmitted instead of login, LO, and collapsed. But from such small beginnings, people traced the history of the internet. Now, that's only one part of the official history. The official history also pretends as if it was initially a defense project to provide only a robust network, grew into the National Science Foundations in linking universities together, and then, of course, into the global communication network, which is when it becomes commercial. And the United States formally turns it over to so-called private hands, but essentially keeps the control over the route, the internet, the protocol systems that come into being, creating the ICANN as the body for this, all of it under the direct or indirect control of the United States. So we have this official start, which is supposedly more research, though has a military underpinning and a military funding, then an university next phase, and then a commercial phase. And I'll come to the commercial phase later. But if you talk to the first two phases, which is where the real technical infrastructure we see today was built, there are things which are missing. And let's talk about the technical part first. As we know, this what is called the Internet Protocol, the TCP/IP, all of this developed in this period, 10-15 years that is there. What is not focused, which of course we all know, those who are interested in the technical history of the internet, is the fact that you also got the understanding of the datagram, which was not a part of the ARPANET initial work. And this came really from the French work of Cyclade's network, which was really the one who pioneered this concept of the host relaying the packet, and the packet was then structured in a particular way. So this made really why the robustness of the network, and the fact that it was the hosts who were responsible for delivering the packet. The whole common concept of datagram really came from the Cyclade's network, what we see as a packet today, the structure of that and the format of that packet, and Louis Pouzon was the person who had pioneered this. So among the founders, which are all publicly stated and known, his name has somehow slipped down the memory well, as it were, though recently he's been accepted as one of the founders of the internet as well. So that's why I'm bringing it up, because it's a sort of forgotten chapter, because the French telecom companies which is a state company, did not support it. So finally the research network really closed down, but gave the concept to what becomes the TCP/IP later. The other part of it, which is also an unknown or little known facts about the history of the internet, which becomes much more important later, is this military history. And the fact that from the beginning, from the Vietnam War onwards, there was this demand from the military that we need to process large amounts of information, including visual information, because they had all the sensors they had put on what they call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which North Vietnam to South Vietnam, the route that the North Vietnam, the Vietnamese Liberation Forces used. And in that, this whole history of the military origins and the military significance, which then flowers out into what we now know as NSA and the surveillance state, really lies here. And Yash Levine has brought out in the book a lot of that history, which I think is also equally important, because these are the parts which are airbrushed out of history. We don't know about them. They seem to have shared the premises. They have to shared people. They had people who actually foresaw what its role was to be and did from the beginning have that direction, that this was as much about a surveillance network in coming into being, that if it does become a major communication network, surveillance should be somehow built into the genetic code of this network. And that's why a lot of the things you find missing, which we complain today that we didn't think about it in the beginning. If it was so, then this should have been relatively privacy, which is what now people are accepting as a fundamental right that people have, could have been also put into the internet. Now, is it an act of omission by not thinking about it? Was it an act of commission? Now, those are the questions that Yash Levin's book really raises. So I think we have to know from the beginning that the surveillance part of it was perhaps also the intended part of the internet, and it is not innocence through which this network has come into being, in which individuals' privacy are not really protected. So I think that could have been one of the conscious decisions taken right at the beginning. Or maybe it happened by accident. But looking at Yash Levin's book, it doesn't appear to be that this was really an accident.
And talking more about the internet as it is today, Tim Berners-Lee, who is the inventor of the World Wide Web, said in a statement that the internet has the power to change our lives for the better, but this power is being subverted increasingly. So what do you think about this statement?
Well, let's put it very clearly what technology really does. Technology by itself is neither emancipatory nor destructive. It is of course used by human beings in both these ways. Of course, some technologies by inherently have more destructive potential than emancipatory potential, nuclear explosions being one of them. We have yet to find any emancipatory benefit of nuclear explosions, but of course the destructive capacities are well known. The internet from the beginning was thought by a lot of people as a great liberating force, and to be honest, even I, who should have been much more skeptical about it, thought that it is going to bring out communications which is going to not be concentrated in the hands of a few companies, but would be possible to have groups controlling it and therefore have a network which is much more, instead of broadcast model, which is what the conventional media model has been, to be able to have a different kind of decentralized model of communication. What we didn't anticipate is a rise of the platforms who have really converted what was a peer-to-peer network into essentially centralized networks. So we don't communicate to each other, we really communicate through Google or Facebook. In fact, 60 to I think 70% of today's traffic, internet traffic, is only Google and Facebook. I think 50% is Google, about 20% is Facebook. So we have already seen the major centralization of the internet that has happened by virtue of these platforms which have come into being and through which we are connecting. We are no longer connecting as internet was originally thought to have been a flat peer-to-peer structure. So that is one part. Why did that happen? It happened because the United States thought that they, having lost the manufacturing edge, they could actually use the internet for a whole bunch of commercial things. And we must say, to the credit of the United States, they are very unhappy about it. The United States, therefore, in its own national interest, decided that it must be kept as an American preserve. In fact, the congressional discussions on this, when the ICANN was sought to be made a little more independent, was essentially this is our internet. So the IP addresses were given essentially by earlier Stanford and later by Department of Commerce giving it out to ICANN. So all of this, even today, is a giant enclosure by which you have enclosed the entire internet space, as it were, the addresses, all of it under US Department of Commerce, because quote unquote the US built the internet. So that also means that almost all the strategic resources of the internet, the root servers, etc., are really controlled by the United States, and they control what's really going to happen in this world. So what that has done is essentially removed the nation states as actors in this and made it much more as US companies and US government driven. And the US companies have obviously a pole position in this, and that's why the major US companies have, or the major internet companies are US companies. Of course, China is the only one which has been able to protect itself because of what is called the Great Firewall of China, by which they have protected their sovereign internet space, so to say. It has not been for surveillance purposes as people think, because as we know, NSA has done wholesale surveillance of all its people.
Yeah.
So that's not the issue. The issue has been they have been able to protect themselves from Googles and Facebooks. So therefore they have, behind the Great Firewall of China, they have a protectionist policies by which their companies like Alibaba, WePay, WeChat, all of others have developed. And all of that has meant this is the only other place which you have independent internet companies. Coming back to the issue that Tim Berners-Lee talked about, that is much more happening in the media space, which is much more visible. That instead of access to information, knowledge, and so on, what you are getting is really a flood of fake news, distortions, hate. So what used to be said about monetary circulation, bad coins drive out the good ones. This is what we are seeing, that is tending to drive out the news, and increasingly what you're getting is fake news masquerading as news. So how do you control it? It's still a major issue. I will say that yes, this is something that is in a situation of transition, and we are seeing major effects of this. This is really the platform companies who are interested essentially in larger spread of their reach, and therefore fake news circulates faster than real news. So this is the reason where the platforms, though they have a professed interest in controlling so-called fake news, what they're really doing is trying to see that the virality, which is what they thrive on, because that's where the advertising dollars come from, that is retained. And so virality means that ultimately fake news to be not to be covered but allowed free play, because that's what they are much more viral than good or real news. The other part of it, which is also dangerous, which is where the US control over the companies, all of it matters, that what is good news and bad news is then decided by New York Times, Washington Post, and so on. So this would mean that before 2003, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Okay, that's what the New York Times, Washington Post was saying, and anything else which contradicted that view would be considered fake news by the kind of filters Google, Facebook, and others putting in place. So what we are going to get is much more American controlled view of the world of news than anything else, and that again creates a problem, that having lost out in manufacturing, they still retain control over the soft sphere, which is information, which is news, which is entertainment, which then can be controlled in this particular way. And what would happen is NewsClick would be fake news if it said what's happening in Syria. But if New York Times or Economist say things which are obviously false, like as we said, weapons of mass destruction case in the case of Iraq, which they did, then it would be considered real news. So these are the problems that we get, and it really comes more from the control of the internet by the United States and its companies, and the fact that this entirely, the economic model of the platforms are built on essentially virality. And that is something that we still do not really know how to control. The only hope is people's good sense over a period of time would reject all of this and the good will surface. And this is not going to happen spontaneously, but it would really require people's movements and education by movements to be able to do so. I don't think spontaneously capital and big companies have.
So Prabir, what steps do you think need to be taken to make internet a more accessible, a more secure, decentralized and sovereign space?
I think one of the issues has already been raised, even in the United States, by relatively centrist candidates like Elizabeth Warren, who has talked about curbing monopoly power. Tim Wu, who coined the phrase net neutrality, has also talked about monopolies need to be restrained. in the interest of capital itself. So that's a kind of argument which is also coming, not from the economic right, which believes that capital is the best bet for spreading the good cheer. Good cheer is probably funding in their own pockets, but leaving that out, you have also the Modi phenomena here, who regards the rich, the capitalist, as the wealth creator, not the people who actually do the work.
Yeah.
So leaving that out, the centrist position has been that monopolies need to be contained in the interest of capital itself. I think that view is also going to come up, which means what happened to AT&T, breakup of the telecom network and creating, instead of one Ma Bell, 7 sisters. That was the breakup of the Bell company. So these are different ways of looking at it. I do think that countries which are what would be called conventionally the third world, though China would also be in that range, and also also Russia, because they all are now trying to fight the dominance of American companies. Then we have to work out, how do we do it? Should it be by supporting Indian capitalists, Russian capitalists, Chinese capitalists, or do we have a relatively more egalitarian view of the internet? I think these are the questions we have to look at. We have something which we have been talking about, which is what's called the JustNet coalition. And our view has been that, like the telecom infrastructure, like the railway infrastructure, like the road infrastructure, the internet infrastructure should be considered as public utility.
Yeah.
And once you consider it a public utility, the rules of public utility, which has to be put in place, which means that it must be for larger public good. It's not that you can't make money out of it to a reasonable amount, but what the policies are have to be decided by the basis of what is the larger public good, and that is what infrastructure is supposed to be, irrespective of whether you believe in capitalism or socialism or something else, if there is. But all of it should still have this as the basic way of looking at the internet itself, because today it's a way of accessing knowledge, it's a way of talking to each other, it's a way of getting entertainment. This is the basic backbone across which all these services move. So that backbone has to be there for a public utility. Now we can extend this further, but at least that's a basic sine qua non of getting the internet move beyond where it is now. And also then this public utility must ensure that the rights of the people, the fundamental rights of the people, have to be protected. And last of all is what happens to surveillance, that the nation states must be prevented from making it into a surveillance network. So we have also to see how we can bake the rights of the people into the core of the internet protocols themselves. That's a much longer way to go. As I said, we suffer from the historical problem that these were purposely or inadvertently left unprotected. So how to bake this back into the internet network protocols is not an easy answer.
Thank you, Prabir, for joining us today. And that's all the time we have. Keep watching NewsClick.